Good evening, everyone. My name is Feroza Godrej, and I'm a member of the board of the Asia Society India Center. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, Asia Society is a leading educational organization dedicated to building awareness about art, culture, business, policy, technology, and education emanating from across Asia on the global stage. Today, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to an exciting discussion around journalist and Asia 21 leader Barkha Dutt's recently joint book titled To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID, published by Juggernaut. As everyone knows, Barkha Dutt is an award-winning TV journalist, anchor and columnist with more than 2 decades of reporting experience. She is India's only Emmy-nominated journalist who has won multiple national and international awards, including the prestigious Padma Shri conferred on her, which is the 4th highest civilian honor in India. Barkha has reported from some of the toughest spots and conflict zones in India and across the world, including Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Egypt. She is the founder editor of Mojo, a multimedia events and content venture, is a featured columnist with Washington Post, appears regularly as an analyst on CNN and BBC, and is also a contributing editor at The Week magazine. Barkha's book, To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID, is a product of 2 years exemplary journalism displayed by her during the pandemic. This is a plug for the book, for Barkha, for Tina, for everybody who has ventured into this field. It is an amazing book. I have read it. I have flagged it down. There are emotional bits about her father. She talks about gender equality. She talks about parity, disparity within the classes. I normally flag down everything I like to read, but I'm going to let the 2 speakers this evening do those honors. It documents all that her small team of 4 witnessed and experienced as they left Delhi, packed in a Maruti Ertiga, shortly after the lockdown imposed in India in March, on the 20th of March, 2020. They covered 30,000 kilometers, 14 states and union territories in over 100 days. In her book, Barkha writes, and I quote, "On Instagram, celebrities baked banana bread. Upper class, middle class were startled by how blue the skies were. And out on India's highways, in a parallel universe, millions of Indians began the long march for survival and solace with their families," unquote. True to its name, Barkha's book is about people, the humans of COVID, and not the numbers. It's about Manju from the Kundli village of Haryana, about the elderly who were abandoned by their families, about those whose bodies were stacked against the river Ganga, and millions of children pushed out of school, system lacking access to online schooling. Equally, the book is also about the Hindu gravedigger at a Muslim burial ground, a Muslim volunteer who performed the last rites of a 6-month-old Hindu baby, about gurdwaras that ran out of oxygen and langars, and a nurse who found it easier to battle terrorists than COVID. Barkha's grit and courage brought out some of the most hard-hitting reportage of the pandemic across India, reminiscent of her first field coverage during the Kargil War, packed with stories and narratives of a people and an India often forgotten. This book creates room for self-reflection on our values and vision for our country. If you haven't ordered your copy, please go ahead and order it now. And this evening, Barkha is in discussion with the indomitable Tina Brown. Welcome. An award-winning journalist, editor, author, and founder of the Women in the World Summit, something really close to my heart. Between 1979 and 1998, she was editor-in-chief of Tatler, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. Tina Brown is the author of 2 best-selling books, The Diana Chronicles and The Vanity Fair Diaries. She founded Women in the World, in 2009 as a live journalism platform for female leaders, CEOs, celebrities, and global activists, and hosted its first summit in 2010. It's amazing some of the women who have appeared on the summit stage, including Hillary Clinton, Queen Rania, Susan Rice, Ruha Ghani, former First Lady of Afghanistan, Oprah, Nicole Kidman, Scarlett Johansson, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Lehman Bowie and Nadia Murad, both from very, very difficult countries, Liberia and Iraq. Tina Brown launched Live Media in 2014 to expand women in the world internationally with summits in London, Toronto, Dubai, Delhi, and of course, throughout the United States. Before we proceed, a bit of housekeeping. We'll end the program with a Q&A session, and we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the program. From our audiences on Facebook, please drop your question in the comments section. We will try our best to answer as many questions as we can, and I think Barkha is going to pick them up. So I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this evening. And Tina, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Feroza. And it could not be a bigger pleasure to me than to be able to talk at this moment to my old friend and unbelievable heroine, as far as I'm concerned, the legendary journalist Barkha Dutt. This book kept me up at night. It is absolutely harrowing, absolutely compelling, and Barkha has done her very best work as the great storyteller that she is. Barkha, you're incredible. So I wanted to ask you straight away, really, what was the moment that you decided that the COVID pandemic was the defining story of our time and that you had to get out on the road and talk about it?
Thank you, Tina. And it means the world to me to have you in conversation with me about what I think is probably the most definitive piece of work that I have produced over these past 2 years, even though I've been a journalist now for almost 25 years. I remember that evening in March when Prime Minister Modi, in a televised address to the nation, announced that India would be shutting down. In itself, this was not a surprise. Much of the world had embraced the path of lockdowns to fight the pandemic. We had 4 hours notice before 1.3 billion people were asked to stay indoors. The one thing India did that perhaps very few countries or maybe nobody else, no other country did, was to close public transport. We did not know as a country at that time that this would have devastating consequences at a humanitarian level. The next day, I just decided, quite just out of curiosity, to step out of the studio and see what was happening on the streets on the first day of the lockdown. And I found to my horror that the borders of the capital, there were men, women, and little children walking on foot, just leaving the city. And there was no one there to stop them. And they had their universe, as it were, tied into little cloth sacks carried on the top of their head along with their toddlers. And I realized quite in that very moment that something extraordinary was happening here alongside the devastating consequences, Tina, of the pandemic. And that it was not, as I sort of rushed to keep pace with these people who were walking, one man who was a factory worker said 2 things to me that would be the definitive truth of this pandemic. He said, if we were not poor, we would not be walking. And he said, the poverty will kill me before the virus will. And that was one of the key lines, I thought, that was so kind of haunting, that actually this parallel crisis was so much more harrowing in a sense for these people than simply the virus itself, which was everyone else was consumed by. I mean, here in America, we really didn't know this was going on in India. Of course, there were stories about, the migrants on the road, but, 1 or 2 stories and then it evaporated. We had no idea that this horror was being played out. I mean, why did this happen? I mean, that's the thing that I can't get over. I mean, why could such a thing in the political classes have been allowed to happen? How did this decision get made that just simply dispatched these terrifyingly, challenge people out there, like no money, like just to simply fend for themselves on the roadways of India? I think nobody anticipated that people would move in the millions, making it the largest mass movement of people since the partition of India, and some estimates say larger. And I think the reason is that we make an assumption, and perhaps we do this everywhere in the world, that the poor only need to survive and they don't have the same emotions as the rest of us. And that emotion, quite simply, is that when you think you're going to die, possibly, you want to die with the people you love. And so when millions moved, risking their lives at that time to do so, they did so, one, because they had no way to earn a living anymore. They were all daily wages in a city where the economy came to a standstill. But they also moved because they wanted to go home to be with their wives and their children and their parents. And they had the same impulse as the rest of us. If we're going to die, let us not die alone. Let us at least die with the people we love and where we feel relatively safe, even if it's the end.
Well, I mean, when you hit the road, you didn't do this as a sort of network talking head. I mean, you got into the car with just a cameraman and a producer, and you literally hit the road and followed this train of humanity. Tell me a little bit about what that experience was like for you, Barkha.
I came from the background of, having worked in big television channels, being used to sort of large mammoths of teams and satellite vans and the rest of it. And what's interesting is that reporting COVID coincided with my journey as a sort of media entrepreneur in the digital space. And what I found, and this gives me some hope, is that it didn't really matter whether the size of your team was 4 or 40. What mattered was the stories that you were telling. And that technology suddenly made it possible to not need those big satellite vans. That technology had evolved to a point where your phone could be configured to a high resolution camera with broadcast quality and better sort of video and audio. And all that was left was for you to have the passion to go out there and give voice to people that didn't have a voice. And unfortunately, especially during the first wave, India had 2 devastating waves and a third not so bad wave. But unfortunately, in the first wave, my erstwhile media, I'm a child of television, my erstwhile medium flubbed the story. Most channels confined themselves to inside studios, anchoring from home. And I think a lot of this happened in other parts of the world as well. Just talking to experts, doctors, medical professionals. And very few people, at least in India in the first wave, went out in big media to meet the people and give voice to their story. And, I've covered war and riot and conflict, and I'm tough. But this was the toughest thing I've ever done, and also the most tragic, and also the magnitude and the scale and the length of it. And then I realized that there was no other way. There was no other way to do justice to this. And also, let's face it, in our lifetime, this is the world's biggest news story that we're ever going to be asked to report on. And if we were going to do it from inside our studios, then, to me, it would feel like we were failing our impulse and our duty and, everything that we think we are as journalists.
How did these people sort of respond to you coming at them, with microphone and asking them to tell their story? Did they want to talk about their story? Were they bitter with the ruling classes that had done this to them? How were they responding to this utter tragedy that had been inflicted on them, within hours' notice?
Well, I think they looked upon me, and I looked upon myself as well, as a bit of a city slicker who, in the end, while they walked, I eventually did get back to my car. And my car may have been basic, but I wasn't walking, and I wasn't starving, and I wasn't invisible to the great Indian state, So that class difference was always there, and I felt weirdly guilty, but I knew that there was nothing I could do except, as powerfully as possible, give voice to what they were going through. Consent was very important. It was a difficult balance, even with all my experience. You didn't want to go thrusting cameras in the faces of people who were already living the worst moment of their lives, or the most difficult moment of their lives. So I had to say, can I talk? Would you like to talk? And overwhelmingly, whether it was the millions of men and women and children walking on the highways, or later in the second wave, dying outside the shut doors of hospitals, on the streets, on the pavements, inside ambulances, at funeral grounds, what I found was that 99% of the people I met wanted to be to be chronicled. In this sort of cataclysmic moment, nobody wanted to die, or nobody wanted the people they loved to die as a statistic, as an untold statistic. And I was actually struck by how much people wanted to be counted, and which is why in this book, there is nobody I write about who I do not name. Sometimes it was difficult for me. I had to go back and find them. I had to go through scraps of paper, little numbers I'd saved in my phone. I couldn't find everybody that I had met. I revisited some of them. But everybody had one thing in common, whether they were rich or poor. They wanted to be documented. And maybe we're not ready right now. It's raw to read this book, but one day we will be. And this is our collective story. It's not just my story. It's not just a journalistic story. It's bearing witness to history. And I think one day we will be ready to revisit it.
What about the people who were in those incredibly densely packed slums and who were together? How are they managing? The ones who weren't on the road, but who were just, 6 and 7 to a room?
Yeah, that's such a great question because, like so many other people, I totally bought into the stay at home, stay safe slogan. The world had followed it. India too sort of asked its people to stay at home. And then I ended up in Dharavi in Mumbai, which is Asia's biggest slum tenement. And as I walked through it and I found 8 people in rooms that were frankly smaller than my closet, I realized that this was such an unthought through thing. We had done what we thought the world was doing, and we had copy and pasted it to the Indian experience. But this was a community where there were 8,000 community bathrooms for 800,000 people. This was, we're talking about a country where 92 million households live in homes that are one room or just a little bigger. And so actually, what we know now, that the virus is airborne, the disease is airborne, that open spaces are better, that public parks are better than shoving 7 people inside of a room. We didn't maybe know this at that time. And so we just sort of did what the world was doing. And in a highly hierarchical, stratified, and unequal emerging economy such as ours, this was not a good fit. And the first wave, we learned from this. In the second wave, we did not have a national lockdown because we made all of these sort of fatal errors in the first wave. And we made new errors, of course, in the second wave. But staying at home did not ensure safety.
Well, of course, and it was the thing that exposed inequity more than anything. I mean, the enormous gap between the people, the middle class people, the rich people who had a second home to go to, who could just simply say, okay, I'm working on my laptop, from my nice, air-conditioned living room. So incredibly different from being crammed into this hovel, essentially, with people who very often were sick as well. It was absolutely incredible. Some of the stories in the book I found absolutely haunting. Tell the story about what happened to the 20 tribal migrant workers who were found in Aurangabad. That story was just unbelievable.
Tina, you know this, that sometimes a single image captures an entire calamity better than any sort of words can. And for me, that image was the sight of a roti, a piece of bread, that lay on the rail tracks of this town in Maharashtra, the western state of Maharashtra called Aurangabad. And this piece of roti, which was packed lunch, dinner, maybe the only meal these tribals would have, was all that remained of these workers who left once again, like so many others had, the place of their work to go back to their village. They came from an extremely remote village, which was thousands of kilometers away. And they were walking to, the trains had actually started by now from a few stations, and they were trying to walk to the nearest rail point from which they might be able to catch a train. That walk in itself was a few hundred kilometers. They stopped for the night to sleep in a sort of spot where they thought would be safe because there were no passenger trains on those tracks. And they also thought it would be safe because the police had been weaponized, unfortunately, to enforce a very, very strict restriction on the movement of people during this lockdown. And as they slept at about 4 a.m, a goods train carrying essential supplies basically came through the darkness and ran over these workers as they slept on those tracks, leaving only those pieces of bread, that stale sort of meal that was yesterday's dinner, as I write in the book, packed as today's lunch. And to me, that epitomized just how haunting and despairing this moment would have been. And I actually went back to the village where these men came from to try and give them names and faces. And even just to get to the village, I had to walk a few kilometers in from the nearest car point, abjectly poor. And it just reminds you that, we live in bubbles. We've all had a really tough time, irrespective of whether we're rich or poor, urban or rural. But when they build this virus as the great equalizer, I say in the book that nothing could have been more untrue.
Absolutely, totally the reverse, actually. The book is dedicated, of course, to your father, Speedy Dutt, who died from COVID as you were reporting the book. And this was for you, must have been the most, well, it was for you, I know, the most devastating moment when you went from reporting the story to living the story. Tell us about the moment when that happened, that crossover happened, and all of a sudden, there you were in a horribly ill-fitting ambulance trying to save your father.
Yeah, I was out in the field reporting. It was the second year that I was still doing COVID, and it was the second wave. And I got a phone call from my home in Delhi to say that my father had been diagnosed with COVID. My father was in his early 80s. He was diabetic, but in reasonably a self-contained man who liked his independence. And the doctors initially tried to say, don't come to hospital, because by now we knew that there was no space in hospitals. Getting a bed was impossible. And also, of course, the moment you send somebody you love to hospital, you never saw them again, because while as a reporter, and here's the big irony of my life, and I'm haunted by this guilt, while as a reporter, I was able to go with consent inside ICUs and report from COVID hospitals. As a daughter, I was not allowed to visit my father, naturally so. And so this was ironic. I had been with COVID patients for a year plus, but I could not be with the one COVID patient that I needed to be with, which was my dad. And when his condition worsened, with my privilege, I was able to get him a hospital bed, and I had to sort of use the numbers in my diary, call doctors I knew, beg, plead, get that bed. But the hospital had an ambulance that was out on runs. So we hired a private ambulance, not knowing that it was just a repurposed, ramshackle little van. It arrived with a single cylinder at the back on seats that had worn out with no paramedics and a single driver. I hesitated to place my father in that so-called ambulance, but I was too panic-stricken and thought that every minute we lose, we would possibly be endangering him more. So I took the chance, loaded him up with a nurse at the back of this car, sat in the front seat, and we raced to the hospital. Ironically, there were traffic snarls on the way, because even now we had a police-imposed approach to this lockdown. So there were police barricades everywhere. And I was tweeting the Chief Minister of Delhi saying, we need a green road, a green passage for ambulances, because it wasn't just my dad's ambulance. I could see a string of ambulances that were getting halted by these police barricades. Anyway, by the time we reached the hospital, my father was initially going to be admitted into a private room. But when we reached the hospital, we found that the cylinder had malfunctioned and the high flow oxygen had not been administered in a high flow way. His levels had plummeted. His levels had worsened because the cylinder didn't function as it ought to have. And now he needed to be admitted to an ICU, but there was no ICU bed. So once again, I used my relative privilege. I begged the hospital, a promoter, that he had to do something to get my father a bed. It took a bit of time. I sat there with him sitting in that wheelchair in the foyer of the hospital. That was the last time I was able to see him alive and have a conversation with him. 5 days later, he was dead. We had to cremate him at the nearest ground to the hospital, because bringing his body home would have meant crossing the Delhi border, which needed police permission. At the cremation ground, there was no space. We had to ask the police for help. The cremation ground was crowded. The police came in, helped us cremate my father. I came home that evening and I tested positive for COVID. I isolated, continued to talk about what had happened, which a number of people wondered how I could do, but I had no other way to make sense of what had happened except to keep working, even as I isolated in my basement. And I then got out as soon as I could and went back on the road and started reporting again, because I think that I'm not equipped And I think, Tina, you would understand this. I think some of us are cut from this cloth. I'm not equipped to deal with grief. I don't know what to do with grief. I'm helpless with grief. So I channel it into work. And that seemed the only thing available to do anyway.
Well, that really struck me too, reading the book, that you said it wasn't just the horrors of what you saw, but also confronting loss for you was extremely painful and hard to process. Of course, then it went personal for you. How long did it take you to sort of figure out how to do that, how to confront loss, how to process that grief?
I think I haven't processed that grief. I think the closest I've come to it is in the writing of this book. And I think that what happened in India and possibly everywhere in the world is that you became part of a community of mourners. And so while the grief was intensely personal, it was also universal. So when I write about my father in a chapter called Fathers and Daughters, I also write about many other daughters who lost their fathers. And these were daughters I met along the way. And somewhere there was this strange connection with perfect strangers. I've always known how to do that as a journalist. It's my job. But this time it was different because it was also my own experience, not just me, the chronicler, but me, the protagonist in the story I was telling. And there was something about being able to compare notes about loss. That was the only thing that actually enabled me to somewhat process it. And I remember this schoolgirl who was all of 15, whose father was sent to election duty that he had no choice in. And then he died from COVID. And this girl told me, well, ma'am, your father died too. And I said, well, that's true. But my father wasn't forced into, he didn't die from something that he had no choice in. And to that extent, for a 15-year-old to tell me that was just extraordinary. And I think the closest I've come to processing it, and I still haven't, because I haven't been able to go to my father's room till now, it's going to be a year in April, was because I was able to meet other people who had lived exactly the same loss as I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can imagine that connection must have been very profound. And of course, it was not only treating the sick that was also traumatic, but burying the dead. I mean, that again was just another round of horror in the whole story, as was the swirls of superstition and sort of ignorant fears and all of these things that you encountered. Can you just talk about that a little bit, about the trauma that became the burial experience in India?
Yeah, it started with extreme paranoia in the first wave, not enough known, and some amount of belief that if you came anywhere close to somebody who had COVID, you would get it too, and that the cost could be social ostracism. And there was a kind of ill-conceived thing that happened in some cities in India where little stickers were posted outside the doors of houses where people were diagnosed with COVID, immediately leading them to be treated as social outcasts in their own neighborhoods and so on. So people were really terrified. And this applied, by the way, we had two kinds of despair. One was the despair of not being able to say goodbye to somebody you love. But the other was loving them, but not having the courage to say goodbye to them. And so we actually had people abandoning the bodies of their own family members, leaving them sometimes at hospital doors. We had little children, little babies. I met somebody whose wife died, and the baby was therefore had to be aborted, was 6-month-old. And the father of this child had a daughter, 9-year-old daughter, and he could not tell his daughter the truth about the mother having died, the pregnant mother. So he told her she's gone to heaven to fight COVID with goddess Durga. And because he hadn't told his daughter the truth, he couldn't actually go and bury, and in Hindu custom, babies are buried and not cremated. He couldn't actually go and bury this child, the 6-month-old stillborn child that was going to be his second daughter. And he was Hindu, and a Muslim volunteer then went and buried this baby and at a Hindu crematorium. And we saw many instances like this. We saw some very ugly sides to human beings born from prejudice and fear and stigma and paranoia. But we also saw enormous sort of kindness and generosity and the human spirit and people coming together and the intimacy of strangers powering so many of us and keeping those connections alive and still giving us some reason to keep going. And burials and cremations became an extremely politicized conversation eventually because of the gap between how many people have actually died and how many people we officially counted. That gap could be, we now know, in the millions. And one of the ways we could document how many people how many more people had died than the official tallies were telling us was to actually go to these grounds. So I spent a lot of 2021 at cremation grounds, at burials, at mass shallow graves along the riverbanks, and literally counting the dead that weren't being counted.
Well, of course, the medical workers themselves were under the most incredible pressure, and they were sometimes attacked, you write too, which really startled me to read about. And you said, I think, that more medical workers were actually attacked in India than any other country. What do you ascribe that to?
Again, stigma. There were certain things in India that were unique to the Indian experience of COVID, and I'm sure it happened in other parts of the world, but I haven't tracked that. I can only speak about what I observed. And there was extreme fear. It was almost as if in large parts of India, people did not. Okay, so either you could not get access to a test, but there were also places where you did not want to get tested. And you did not want to get tested because you thought that you would be shunned. You thought you would be asked to leave the housing society. And maybe you thought, oh my God, I'm going to die and I don't want to find out that I'm going to die.
I mean, this is like the Black Death in England, in the 17th century with the crosses on the door and the kind of the whole sense of like, this house is a pariah house. This person is a pariah person. And very often they were left to starve because nobody wanted to touch them.
It was exactly like that, at least to begin with. And, and in this process, you also discover that there were people who were still washing bodies before they were, sent to be buried or cremated. As I said, the volunteers. And then the people who were doing this were still ostracized because they were at the bottom of some caste and social hierarchy where they were considered impure because they were actually touching the bodies that nobody else was willing to touch. And I think these attacks on medical workers, and there's a particularly haunting story of a doctor in Madras in Chennai, Dr. Samuel, who wanted to be buried at a certain cemetery behind the church he used to pray at. And when his best friend, who was also a doctor, took him, the family and the friends were attacked with bricks and stones by people who just didn't want any COVID patients in the cemetery because they thought if bodies come here, everybody's going to get COVID. It was just complete misinformation and fake news and stigma and fear and paranoia and everything rolled into one. And it mattered so much to people that this doctor's family then went to court, and it was a year later, his body was exhumed from where he was eventually cremated, and he was brought to where he had wanted to be buried. But the point is that these attacks, we made such a sound about and such a noise about how much we respected our healthline workers. And I think for the most part, of course, we do. But when it came to even giving them dignity in death, our health workers did not always receive that because they were seen as not just saviors, but also potential carriers of COVID. And therefore, they were treated with this kind of paranoia.
I mean, there's so much here to process in the years ahead, right? I mean, how this settles out, how people view this going forward is one of the things that I'm very interested in, actually. I mean, the other question, of course, was about the vaccine, right? I mean, India is one of the world's leading vaccine manufacturers, but it experienced what you've called a vaccine catastrophe. So what happened there?
Well, I think there was a kind of diluted feeling of Indian exceptionalism. The first wave was not very lethal for us, medically speaking. The human catastrophe of what happened to the poor was, in fact, a much more devastating consequence of the first wave of the pandemic. But for some reason, as a percentage of population, our mortality figures, and we don't know why, were not as dire as they were in the rest of the world. We then lulled ourselves into believing that perhaps because we were a hardy people, perhaps because we'd all received vaccines in our childhood, perhaps because we were just exposed to many more viruses, we were better equipped to handle this. And so we did not prepare for the second wave, and we did not purchase our vaccines fast and quick enough. Our first set of formal orders for the vaccine went out in the January of 2021. And it was just hardly enough. I write in the book to even vaccinate half the adult population of one single capital city in India. But that is what we were thinking. The other thing we got mistakenly caught up in was vaccine nationalism. It suddenly became a kind of geostrategic instrument of asserting soft power, which would be great if we had enough vaccines. Except what happened here was we really hoped as a state that the vaccine that India would develop and manufacture would be the vaccine that would save India. In the end, it was the Indian version of the AstraZeneca. 88% of Indians have been vaccinated by what's called Covishield, the Indian version of the AstraZeneca, manufactured in India but not developed in India, that saved the Indian people. And eventually, because we have such experience with mass immunization, our vaccine program really picked up speed. But we were, and you know, the size and the efficiency with which it is done is to be lauded. But we were just too late, and we got caught up in this strange kind of vaccine nationalism, and it was just not the time or the place for it.
No, I understand. I mean, what is the fallout though from this massive catastrophe? I mean, the catastrophe of the inequity. Has that really opened everyone's eyes to the folly of what was done? And are there any reparations that will be made to these people? And what has been the takeaway from this 2 years of hell in the sort of Indian decision-making class?
Well, I think we did learn from some mistakes. When the second wave came, there was no national lockdown. We understood that a lockdown for a country the size and diversity and inequity of India made no sense. We understood that closing public transport was a fatal mistake. To shut down trains and buses and the flights was a colossal mistake. So there were certain lessons learned. We left it more to each individual state to look after their own geographies because every state had its own challenges. But if you mean, are people angry? Are they raging? You'd be surprised to learn that actually the answer is no. When I was traveling through the heartland, and we've just finished with a round of elections where the ruling party has done extremely well. But I had sensed this even while I was reporting on this, because the poor of India in particular approached this with a sense of fatalism. They approached it with a sense of resignation. There are already people who struggle with access to the public health system. It's not as if their access to the public health system otherwise is extremely efficient or is extremely institutionalized in a way that is efficient or equitable. And so you did not see this sort of mass upsurge of rage or revolution or bitterness. There was also context. I think Indians also started looking outside. We looked at the United States of America, where we still have such a strong anti-vax movement where having the vaccine, you still have the luxury to say no. And suddenly in that context, if you sort of, did not look at it in a decontextualized way, people, I don't know if people were forgiving, but they said, okay, maybe the government did the best it could. The world struggled. Some countries are still struggling. The most powerful countries in the world are still struggling. The United States, China. And so people became more fatalistic and more resigned, almost like a sort of black cloud had stormed through our life, and all we could do was to hope for the clouds to lift. I also find, and that's why I wrote this book, that when terrible things happen to a people, the instinct is to block it out. We do it at a personal level, we do it at a collective level, but we don't heal then. And I think that we're in that stage of a nation's grief where we are blocking it out. But there will come a time when we will need to mourn. I think our phase of mourning, both individual and collective, is still to come. And it needs time.
How has it changed you, Barkha, as this whole incredible 2 years? How has it changed you as a journalist and as a woman?
I think that I had, like so many other journalists of my generation, become complacent and maybe a little lazy. It had become easy. I was, as pompous as this may sound, I have a certain autopilot level of efficiency. I could get in front of a camera and present a nightly news show without any thought and without any heart. And I think in that way, I had become a navel-gazing, perhaps political journalist who had lost connection with the stories of ordinary people because they did not occupy the stratosphere in which most of my work was being done. And I think it took me to report this pandemic, to reclaim the person I was, to remember why I'd become a reporter, to remember that it didn't matter if the big people didn't give you interviews, that it wasn't about that. Sure, if those interviews come your way, I still do some of them. I still interview big personalities, but that wasn't why I became a journalist. I became a journalist to be able to change the course, we hope, through work, eventually of policy, of the lives of people. And mostly, if you can't communicate with your audience, what are you even doing? But we had narrowed our audience down to this little sliver of elite people whom, especially as an English-speaking journalist, we made programming for. So I think for me, it didn't change me as a journalist. It just reminded me who I was, and it helped me return to the person I was. So not Barkha 2.0, but Barkha 1.0. Did it change me as a woman? Yes. I've always struggled with my gender. It's taken me to get to being 50 to own it, to not feel the need to disown it. In my 20s and my 30s, I was really defensive about it, especially as a war correspondent who had to fight for the opportunity to cover war and conflict and to convince people that it was okay to have a woman at the front. I hesitated to cry. I hesitated to show emotion. I do not hesitate to do any of those things now. I still find it tough to process grief. I think there's a subliminal sense of being considered weak if I do. But I think that I own my gender. I own the fact that I'm possibly depressed in a clinical way, that I may at some point need professional help, therapy even, to get past everything I've observed, not just my loss, but having just relentlessly been exposed to this level of tragedy. And I think it's helped me reprioritize the things I should get agitated about and where I should focus my energies.
Of course, I have to ask you before we go to questions, which we are about to do, what are you going to focus on next?
I think that I have realized two things: that journalism has to be about reporting. It cannot be talking heads driven only. You can have your element of talking heads and great conversations, but you have to report from the ground as often as you can. And you have to not lose sight of issues that matter to people: schools, health, the place of women, and these are deeply political issues. And for us to act as if politics is only what happens in elections is to miss what politics is really about. And if we do want to be political journalists, I think our political journalism should be to intersect and to be able to intersect the lives of people with what governments do, no matter which party they represent. And I very much hope to relearn the art of storytelling that I was able to revisit in this very tragic time, and to use that role of being a storyteller to give voice to people. And that is what I hope to focus
on your digital platform.
On my digital platform, yes.
Congratulations, Barkha. Let's go to questions. I could talk to you all night, but I know others wish to as well. Are we going to have some questions coming up?
Yeah, I can see a few, and I'm just going to maybe read one. How often were government officials present at state borders or containment zones, and what was their response considering not many journalists were reporting from the ground? This is a really interesting question. And one of the things that happened, that was the paradox of the pandemic, was there was either too much of the Indian state present or too little. And let me explain what I mean by this. When millions of people were leaving the cities to go to their villages, you either had in the initial flux nobody. No, and when I say nobody, I mean not even a constable trying to stop them. There was no presence of the state. We could have converted petrol stations, gas stations along the highways, for example, into night shelters. We could have had food laid out at these centers. We didn't think of it as a state. And later, as civil society jumped in where the state had kind of vanished. So that was the absent state. And then there was the overweening authority of the state when it was not needed. So we called out the police. And the irony, of course, is that ordinary policemen and women were also exposed to the virus, were also frontline heroes. But when they were weaponized to be used against fellow citizens, you saw the brutal face of the state. And countless poor people were actually beaten, thrashed. I remember meeting Manoj outside a public hospital, a rickshaw driver, beaten by the cops and left there, and then not able to get medical help because the hospital was only treating COVID patients. And I asked him what had happened to him, and he had walked outside the circumference of his neighborhood, and therefore was in violation of the lockdown because he didn't have money to buy vegetables from the neighborhood store, and he thought going to the wholesale market would enable him to bring back vegetables for cheap for his children, and the police beat him instead. And so my answer to your question would be that the state was either too present or too little present, and it didn't often get that balance right at all. There's a comment, not a question. I shudder to think of the long-term mental health impact of trauma on the human race. The image I can't get out of my head is the rows and rows of funeral pyres and no space for cremation. As a mental health professional, we need grief support groups. Yes, we do. But you know what? We're in such a hurry to, and this is also a stage of grief. So I'm hoping the next stage will come. We are in the blocking out stage. And I think when I say we, this is not just India. I think this is globally. People don't want to deal with this. And I just keep saying, and we saw this during the partition of India, Ashish Nandi, the sociologist, has a great piece of work that I would encourage all of you to read on memory and partition. And basically the argument he makes is that if you bury memory, your scars don't heal. And in the burying of collective memories, you do not heal. So all I'm urging through this book is that yes, we need to move on. I'm all for moving on, but moving on is not the same as forgetting, is not the same as pretending this did not happen, this rupture in our collective emotional being. And I take your point on this. How do you deal, Rupa has a question, how do you deal with the social media trolling that has followed you? It feels like it has increased, not just for you, but for anyone with something to say. Rupa, you're absolutely right. And in particular, Tina asked me a question about being a woman. Women get trolled in a way that men simply don't. The comments on us are highly sexualized, are highly moralistic. Somewhere they take it back to how we look, what we weigh, the color of our skin, who we're dating, who we're married to, whether we're divorced, whether we have children. Yes, all of this, even during the pandemic. I think I have learned to grow. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt. Hillary Clinton said this to me once in an interview, quoting Eleanor Roosevelt, that women need to grow a skin as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. I think I have that hide when it comes to trolling, not inside of me. I mean, I have cried virtually every night in the writing of this book. And Chiki, my editor, I called her one day and I said, I can't write the book. I can't write the book. So it's not that I'm thick-skinned about myself, but I am about trolling because I know that it's a mind game designed to intimidate me and silence me, and that I'm not going to allow. But I do worry for younger journalists, in particular younger women. I know many who have gone off social media platforms because they feel judged. I know intellectually people have modulated their opinions to what they think the dominant narrative of the time is. So we're reaching a point where instead of free speech debates, we're soon going to need to have free thought debates. People are scared to think freely because they're so pressured by the need to conform to a dominant narrative. And I have no good answers to this except to say big tech needs to take responsibility for this. And they have enabled toxicity as something that makes their platforms do very well commercially, and they're accountable for this. You reported the pandemic from the ground without being affiliated with a large media house. How do you think the pandemic has had an effect on you as a journalist, since it's the biggest story of our time? Well, the only thing that gave me hope in these times, apart from sort of the human spirit, and I saw a lot of that, the kindness of strangers, which I've already spoken about, is that the power of storytelling is not determined by whether you have a big media house or a small media house. I think a good story, a powerfully told story is a powerfully told story. We have, of course, also been enabled by technology. And I am hopeful that as more and more people consume content on their tablets and on their phones, the capital barriers that once stopped some of us from going independent will now be more sort of friendly to the individual media entrepreneur, especially if our audiences continue to support journalism that they believe in. How do we understand the imposition of night curfews? It's an absolutely banal, unscientific, anti-science idea. It's completely crazy. COVID doesn't choose a time to visit, and night curfews are just to create the illusion that something is being done when it isn't. Tina, do you want to come in?
Barkha, yes, I have one question which, really I think is critical here, really, which is that, you talked about how as a news anchor, etc., that, you found yourself increasingly cut off from the reporting of such stories as the one you found on the road. But that's not going to change. I mean, big media is still going to be dominated by commercial concerns, by the fact that people are not that interested very often in the big harrowing story in terms of, as we all know, ratings, etc. How much can your digital platform sort of really impact change and get the story out to the point that, which is obviously one of the things we want to do as journalists, is like make that impact, get things changed. How many people are now, for instance, watching those reports that you made? How many watched? And is this what you're going to be doing in the future in terms of just trying to broaden that out? Because TV, I don't think, is ever going to do this.
Look, it's a great question. And I don't want to romanticize a shortage of resources. A shortage of resources makes things difficult, right? It's not that I haven't struggled in those moments or remembered, what it might be like to have 4 more hands than the ones I had. Of course, it would make it easier to have more editors, to have more machines, to have all of that. But the revenue model of big media, at least in India, is broken. The revenue model is broken because they're operating at costs and producing news at costs that they can no longer get back in revenue. And that is, in fact, why television news stopped being reporting driven in India, because there was simply no budgets for it. And everything was linked to advertising revenue, and news became theater. And, Noam Chomsky had this great phrase on manufactured consent when it came to mass media. In India, it was manufactured dissent. You just put 2 extreme voices, you threw them in a television studio, you got them to yell at each other, and you had theater for free, and you call that news. So is it tough being, a small platform? Of course. But what gives me hope? The following gives me hope. We went from being about 50, 60,000 subscribers in the October of 2019 when Mojo was born. We're at 745,000 subscribers today. We're hoping to reach 1 million in the next 2 months. I hope that once we cross that threshold, we are able to go into the market and ask for investment. We're so far, we have no outside investment. We are entirely funded by advertisements that we get as a percentage from YouTube and to people who support us, our audience. We have a support mojo and people do support us. We've had foundations coming forward and supporting us. But your question is absolutely bang on. Till the revenue model is changed, till people are willing to pay for news, I don't think we are going to be able to change the quality of journalism. We need people to be able to pay. This idea that everything on the internet should be free, if that remains the idea, we're not going to be able to elevate the quality. If you'd rather have corporations paying for your journalism and therefore skewing it instead of you, the people, sort of holding some sort of veto power of the kind of journalism that you get, then, Tina, you're right. We are not hopeful. But I am thinking that the amount of feedback you get now from people lamenting what they see on television, if they put their money where their mouth is, and we're not talking big money, we're talking the cost of a Starbucks coffee. If you are
750,000 is an amazing number. I mean, that's a stunning success if you can continue to grow it, which I'm sure you will. And the question, I suppose, is it these big is it the deep dive into this kind of story that's going to grow it, or will you be a more sort of eclectic news platform?
I think we have to be eclectic because, the fact is that everybody needs light and shadow. And I mean, no one demonstrated this better than you, Tina. You taught us, all of us globally, who followed your career, you taught us this with Vanity Fair and New Yorker and Tatler and the Daily Beast, that you need light and shadow, that sometimes you need the glamour to give people a break so that you can focus your audiences on the gravitas and the grassroots. And I learned this from you. And I think that I will not pretend that I'm only going to do stories on the poor. I'm only going to do stories on social injustice. I understand that my audience needs a little bit of a respite. They also sometimes need to feel better. They need a break. Sometimes you need glamorous people to be ambassadors for causes that nobody wants to talk about otherwise. And so I hope to be eclectic, but I hope that what will define me is that it will always be about people. That's what I want to be. I want to be somebody who makes my journalism about people. And I think there have to be ways to do that in a way that's not preachy, that isn't making your audience feel guilty, that isn't standing and being all sanctimonious and humbuggy and somehow saying, we're better. Hey, if you're not feeling guilty, then there's something wrong with you. No, your storytelling, if it isn't powerful, you may as well back up. It all goes back to telling a good story, no matter how big the crisis is.
Well, Barkha, you really have proved that again and again. And in this story, the biggest story of your career, you feel, certainly a defining story, you have excelled in ways that you should feel extraordinarily proud. Thank you so, so much for talking with me. And I know that Asia Society will want to wrap up now, but congratulations.
Thank you, Tina. And again, it means the world to me to have you, in conversation with me. So thank you for your time.